the Miraculous ring a tale of survival and faith amid a devastating earthquake. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 2009, a massive 6.3 magnitude earthquake struck Abruzzo, Italy, shattering buildings and lives in mere seconds. Beneath the rubble of a collapsed apartment complex, nurse Sarah Mitchell lay trapped in a pitch-black void, her only companion a small silver cross ring, her mother's final gift. What the community didn't know was that Sarah, branded a whistleblower and outcast, had chosen to stay behind to save an elderly patient. As rescue teams above debated which sectors to search first, a faint glow emanated from the ring, marking the beginning of a remarkable story of faith, betrayal, and redemption. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that faith and integrity were inseparable, a lesson her mother instilled in her long before gifting her the Silver Cross ring on her deathbed. At 35, working as a senior nurse at St. Mary's Memorial Hospital in Abruzzo, she never imagined that these values would cost her everything she held dear. The first signs of trouble emerged when Sarah noticed discrepancies in the hospital's charity care program. Donations meant for underprivileged patients were being redirected, life-saving medications were mysteriously out of stock, and vulnerable patients were being turned away despite available funds. Dr. Robert Anderson, the hospital administrator, had crafted an elaborate scheme that had gone unnoticed for years, siphoning millions from those who needed it most. Sarah's decision to gather evidence came at a personal cost. Her closest friend and fellow nurse, Emily Parker, discovered her investigation and warned her to stay quiet. "Some things are better left alone," Emily had said, her words carrying an unmistakable threat. But Sarah couldn't ignore the elderly patients forced to choose between medication and food, or the children denied treatment because their families couldn't afford inflated costs. When she finally presented her findings to the hospital board, the response was swift and devastating. Dr. Anderson had prepared for this possibility, fabricating evidence that implicated Sarah in a scheme to embezzle charitable funds. Her pristine 15-year career crumbled overnight. Emily, who had once been like a sister, testified against her, claiming she had witnessed Sarah manipulating patient records. The local media painted her as a disgraced nurse attempting to deflect her own crimes. Former patients, community members, and even her church congregation turned their backs. The only person who stood by her was her mother, Lisa Mitchell, who was battling terminal cancer at the time. "Truth is like light," Lisa had told her, pressing the Silver Cross ring into her palm. "It finds its way through even the smallest cracks." 3 months after Sarah's suspension, Lisa passed away. The funeral was sparsely attended, most people believing the lies about her daughter. Sarah was left alone in a community that had once embraced her, forced to move into a basement apartment in the old part of town, the only place she could afford on her dwindling savings. Yet Sarah refused to abandon her calling. Unable to work at the hospital, she began providing private care to those who would still trust her, mostly elderly patients too desperate for help to care about her reputation. Her rates were minimal, sometimes accepting only gratitude as payment. Through it all, she wore her mother's ring, a reminder that integrity, though costly, was worth every sacrifice. The isolation wore on her. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her. Local shops suddenly found reasons to refuse her service, and anonymous threats appeared in her mailbox. The comfortable life she had built through years of dedicated service had vanished, replaced by whispers and accusatory glances. Even her attempts to find work in neighboring towns were thwarted by Dr. Anderson's influence. But Sarah's faith, though tested, remained unshaken. Each morning she would touch the Silver Cross ring and remember her mother's words. She documented everything, kept gathering evidence, and continued to care for those who needed her most. The basement apartment, initially a symbol of her fall from grace, became a sanctuary for healing and hope. What Sarah didn't know was that her quiet persistence was being noticed. Among her elderly patients, whispers of her kindness began to spread, creating a small underground network of support. These were people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by trusting the disgraced nurse who treated them with dignity when the system had failed them. Among Sarah's patients, James Cooper stood out not just for his quiet dignity, but for the penetrating wisdom in his pale blue eyes. At 78, the former investigative journalist had seen his share of corruption, and something about Sarah's story struck a familiar chord. Their paths crossed when his daughter Jennifer, despite believing the allegations against Sarah, desperately needed in-home care for her father. James lived in the same apartment complex as Sarah, 3 floors above her basement dwelling. Their first meeting was marked by his direct question, "Why do you still care for people who believe you're a thief?" Sarah's honest response that healing wasn't about deservingness but need earned his respect. What began as professional visits evolved into a father-daughter bond that filled the void left by both their losses. Behind his frail exterior, James harbored a sharp mind that never lost its investigative edge. He noticed how Sarah would sometimes skip meals to buy medicine for patients who couldn't afford it, how she maintained meticulous records of every penny she handled, and how she never spoke ill of those who had wronged her. These observations led him to quietly begin his own investigation into the hospital scandal. But using his old journalistic contacts and the computer skills that had surprised many in his generation, James spent his hours between Sarah's visits digging into Dr. Anderson's past. His apartment slowly transformed into an investigative hub, walls covered with printouts and connected strings, like a scene from his reporting days. He discovered similar patterns at 2 other hospitals where Anderson had worked, but the evidence had been buried deep. Sarah knew nothing of James's investigation. To her, their time together was filled with stories of his journalism career, discussions about faith, and his gentle guidance through her ongoing struggles. He became the father figure she had never had, while she filled the void left by his wife's passing years ago. Their conversations often stretched long past the designated care hours, touching on everything from current events to matters of the soul. What touched James most was watching Sarah with other elderly residents in the building. Despite their initial skepticism, her genuine care began winning them over. She would stop to help Mrs. Henderson with her groceries, check Mr. Patterson's blood pressure for free, or simply listen to Mrs. Romano's stories about the old country. James saw in these small acts the truth about Sarah that the community had chosen to ignore. The laptop where James stored his findings became his most prized possession. Sometimes he told Sarah during one of their evening talks, "Justice needs more than truth, it needs the right moment." He never elaborated on this cryptic statement, but his eyes held a certainty that gave Sarah hope. Unknown to her, he had already prepared multiple copies of his investigation, including one mailed to a trusted former colleague. Their bond deepened when James suffered a severe fall, requiring more frequent visits. During these extended care sessions, he began sharing deeper stories about his own battles against corruption as a journalist, the price he had paid for his integrity, and how, in the end, truth had prevailed. These conversations strengthened Sarah's resolve to maintain her dignity despite the ongoing ostracism. The day before the earthquake, James had been particularly insistent that Sarah take an old photo album home with her. "Sometimes the most important evidence isn't what we're looking for," he had said with a meaningful look. Sarah had placed the album on her shelf, planning to look through it during her next free evening, an evening that would never come quietly. In their last normal conversation, James had held her hand and said something that would echo through the coming tragedy. "Faith isn't just about believing in God, Sarah. It's about believing in the power of truth to prevail, no matter how long it takes. Your mother's ring isn't just silver and metal, it's a reminder that light always finds a way through darkness." At 3:32 a.m. on that fateful April morning, Sarah Mitchell was reviewing medical records in her basement apartment, her mother's silver cross ring catching the dim lamplight. The timing wasn't coincidental. She had received an anonymous note suggesting she might find interesting information in the hospital's night shift records. The quiet concentration was shattered by a low, threatening rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The first jolt threw her against the wall, scattering papers like autumn leaves. In those initial seconds of confusion, Sarah's trained medical instincts kicked in. Her thoughts immediately went to James Cooper, alone in his third-floor apartment. The building groaned, a deep, terrifying sound of concrete and steel protesting against nature's fury. Sarah had just reached her door when the second, more violent tremor struck. The walls around her cracked, pieces of ceiling raining down as the electricity failed, plunging everything into darkness. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows in the stairwell. She could hear screams from above, the sound of breaking glass, and the continued rumbling of the earth beneath her feet. Fighting against the swaying floor and falling debris, Sarah began climbing the stairs. The journey that normally took minutes felt like hours. Each step brought new dangers: collapsed railings, crumbling steps, and the constant threat of aftershocks. The silver cross ring on her finger seemed to pulse with an otherworldly warmth, driving her forward despite her fear. On the second floor, she encountered Mrs. Henderson, frozen in terror in her doorway. "Get outside," Sarah shouted, helping the elderly woman toward the emergency exit. Other residents were already streaming past, some injured, all terrified. But Sarah continued upward, driven by the knowledge that James, with his limited mobility, would need help. The third floor was a scene of devastation. Doors had been torn from hinges, walls had collapsed, and the air was thick with dust. Outside James's apartment, Sarah heard his faint calls for help. The door was jammed, requiring all her strength to force it open. She found him trapped beneath a fallen bookshelf, his precious laptop still clutched in his hands. "Leave it," Sarah urged as she worked to free him, but James insisted on keeping the computer. "Everything you need is in here," he gasped, his face pale with pain. As she helped him to his feet, another violent aftershock rocked the building. The floor beneath them began to tilt ominously, and the walls started to buckle. Time seemed to slow as Sarah made a split-second decision. The main stairwell had already collapsed. She could see it through a gaping hole in the hallway. The emergency exit was their only chance, but it was on the other side of the increasingly unstable floor. James stumbled, his grip on the laptop tightening. The building's death throes grew louder. Chunks of ceiling crashed around them as Sarah half-carried James toward safety. They had almost reached the emergency stairs when the floor gave a final, sickening lurch. James pushed the laptop into Sarah's hands with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll read it," he said, his eyes intense with purpose. Before Sarah could respond, the world dissolved into chaos. The floor beneath them split apart like paper in water. The last thing she saw was James's face, eerily calm in the emergency lights, as they both plunged downward. The thunderous roar of collapsing concrete drowned out her scream. Sarah felt herself falling through layers of the building, the laptop still clutched against her chest. Her mother's ring caught a final glint of emergency lighting before everything went black. Impact after impact battered her body as she tumbled through the destruction, unable to tell up from down in the maelstrom of concrete and steel. The final impact drove the air from her lungs. Something heavy pressed against her legs, and the space around her grew impossibly tight. In the total darkness, Sarah could feel warm liquid running down her face and taste dust and blood in her mouth. The laptop dug into her ribs, and James was nowhere within reach of her outstretched hands. Above her, the last sounds of the collapsing building faded into an eerie silence, broken only by distant screams and the settling of debris. Sarah Mitchell, the nurse who had lost everything but her integrity, was now buried in the basement that had been both her refuge and her prison, with only her mother's ring and James's mysterious laptop as companions in the darkness. Consciousness returned to Sarah in waves of pain and confusion. The absolute darkness was so complete that opening or closing her eyes made no difference. Her first coherent thought was of James, and she called out his name, until her voice grew hoarse. The silence that answered told its own devastating story. A quick assessment of her situation revealed the grim reality: she was trapped in a space barely larger than a coffin. Her legs were pinned by something heavy, but she could still feel her toes, a small mercy that her nurse's training told her was significant. The laptop was wedged awkwardly against her chest, its edges digging into her ribs with every breath. The air was thick with concrete dust, making each inhalation a struggle. Through the settling debris, Sarah began to hear sounds from above: distant sirens, shouting, the chaos of emergency response. She tried calling for help, but her voice couldn't carry through the layers of concrete and steel. A bitter irony struck her: the same community that had turned its back on her was now unknowingly passing above, conducting rescue operations while she lay forgotten below. In the darkness, Sarah's hand found her mother's ring, still firmly on her finger. The familiar touch of the silver cross brought an unexpected surge of emotion. "Mom," she whispered, "I could really use your strength right now." As if in response, she remembered her mother's words during chemotherapy: "Pain reminds us we're alive, and being alive means there's hope." Time became fluid in the darkness. Sarah tried to maintain her sense of hours by counting her breaths, but the effort became increasingly difficult as thirst began to torment her. The dust in her throat felt like ground glass, and her lips had already cracked from dehydration. She could hear water dripping somewhere nearby, the sound a torture she couldn't escape. Through her small pocket of air, Sarah began to hear fragments of radio broadcasts from rescue workers' devices above. The news was grim: hundreds trapped, dozens confirmed dead, and resources stretched thin. Then came the words that made her blood run cold: lowest floors of the Santiago building considered non-viable for survivors. Focus rescue efforts on upper levels. The laptop pressed against her suddenly felt heavier with significance. Despite her situation, Sarah managed to pry it open. The screen remained dark, dead, or broken. She couldn't tell. James's last words echoed in her mind: "Everything you need is in here." What truth was so important that he'd risked both their lives to preserve it? As the hours crawled by, Sarah's thoughts turned increasingly to James. She replayed their last moments together: his calm acceptance in the face of disaster, the purposeful look in his eyes as he handed her the laptop. Had he known something was about to happen? The question haunted her as she drifted between consciousness and delirious dreams. The pain in her legs grew worse, and the space seemed to grow smaller with each passing hour. Sarah began to understand why people went mad in such situations. The darkness was more than the absence of light; it was a living thing that pressed against her eyes and filled her lungs. Her only anchor to sanity was the small cross ring, which she rubbed constantly between her fingers. In one of her more lucid moments, Sarah heard something that brought her fully alert: voices arguing directly above her. "We can't waste resources here," one voice said. "Anderson's report says this section is structurally compromised. Too dangerous." The name Anderson cut through her pain like a knife. Even now, buried alive, the man's influence was sealing her fate. Sarah wanted to scream, to tell them she was here, alive, with evidence that could expose everything, but her parched throat could barely manage a whisper. The voices faded away, taking with them perhaps her last chance at rescue. In that moment of despair, her mother's ring seemed to grow warm against her skin, and a strange calm settled over her. "I'm not done yet," she whispered into the darkness, her voice rough but determined. "Mom always said truth finds a way through even the smallest cracks. If this is my test of faith, then so be it." Sarah Mitchell, buried beneath tons of concrete and betrayal, clung to that thought as the darkness pressed in around her. A series of small aftershocks shifted the rubble around Sarah, temporarily widening her prison. Through a newly formed gap, she heard labored breathing nearby. "James," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. The response was weak but unmistakable: "Sarah." "My dear, I'm here. I'm here." The space between them was filled with twisted metal and broken concrete, but they could communicate. Sarah could tell from his breathing pattern that James was critically injured. Her medical training told her what she didn't want to accept: he was bleeding internally, and time was running out. The laptop James coughed, his voice growing weaker. "You need to know. Anderson, it's all there. Every transaction, every death he caused." His words were interrupted by painful gasps. "I've been tracking him for years. Since before you came to the hospital. He's done this before. In other cities. The charity funds, they're just the surface." Sarah pressed herself against the rubble separating them, desperate to help. "Save your strength, James. The rescuers will come," but they both knew it was a lie. The weight of the building above them and the continuing aftershocks made their position increasingly precarious. "Listen carefully," James insisted, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "There's more than just financial fraud. Anderson, he's been experimenting on patients, terminal cases, people without families. Your suspicions about the missing medications, you were right, but it's worse. The deaths, they weren't all natural." His words sent chills down Sarah's spine. A violent cough interrupted him, followed by an agonizing silence. "James," Sarah called out, panic rising in her throat. When his voice returned, it was fainter. "The password. It's Truth Prevails 1944. My first investigation date. Everything's encrypted, but there's a program that will send it all to the authorities if the laptop connects to the internet." Sarah could hear the death rattle in his breathing now, a sound she knew too well from her years of nursing. "Your daughter, Jennifer," she said softly. "I'll make sure she knows you were a hero." James's laugh turned into another cough. "Jennifer, she already knows. She's been helping me. Those night shift records you were looking at, she planted them. She's been working undercover in Anderson's office. My brave girl, following her old man's footsteps." The revelation stunned Sarah. Jennifer, who had publicly scorned her, had been an ally all along. Before she could respond, James's voice became even weaker. "Sarah, you're not alone. There are others, watching, waiting. The ring, your mother's ring." Another aftershock sent more debris shifting around them. When it settled, James's breathing had become even more labored. "The ring," he gasped. "Lisa gave it to you. Because she knew. Your mother. She was helping me investigate Anderson before the cancer." The pieces started falling into place in Sarah's mind. Her mother's insistence that she take the nursing job at St. Mary's, the way she'd pressed the ring into her hand with such significance. "She never told me," Sarah whispered, tears cutting trails through the dust on her face. "She was protecting you," James managed. "But now you need to know the truth. It's time." His voice was barely audible now. "Sarah, you're not just carrying evidence, you're carrying hope. Don't let them bury it." "James, please hold on," Sarah pleaded, but she could hear the life slipping away from him. His final words came in a whisper that she had to strain to hear. "The light. I can see the light. Lisa. She's here," she says. "She's so proud of you, Sarah, so proud. Proud." Then there was only silence. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold concrete, tears flowing freely now. In the darkness she clutched her mother's ring, feeling the weight of James's sacrifice and the responsibility he'd placed on her shoulders. The laptop against her chest no longer felt like a burden. It was a testament, a last mission from a man who'd spent his final years fighting for justice. Above her she could hear rescue workers moving through the rubble, their voices growing fainter as they moved away from her location. In the deepening silence, Sarah made a solemn vow to both James and her mother: the truth would not stay buried, no matter how deep Anderson had tried to hide it. In the suffocating darkness following James's death, Sarah's world narrowed to the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant rumble of rescue operations above. Through a small gap in the rubble, fragments of radio communications drifted down, each broadcast more devastating than the last. The rescuers were moving away, focusing on other areas deemed more likely to yield survivors. A news report crackled through. Dr. Robert Anderson, Chief Administrator of St. Mary's Hospital, has taken charge of coordinating medical response efforts. In a statement, he expressed particular concern about former nurse Sarah Mitchell, last seen in the building, and wanted for questioning regarding missing charitable funds. The familiar voice of Dr. Anderson followed, dripping with false concern. Our thoughts are with Ms. Mitchell, though we fear she may have fled the area before the earthquake. The irony of his words struck Sarah like a physical blow. Here she lay, branded a fugitive while trapped beneath the very building she'd refused to abandon. The radio continued. Sources suggest Mitchell may have stolen additional funds before the disaster. Police urge anyone with information to come forward. Even in the midst of tragedy, Anderson was manipulating the narrative, ensuring that if her body was found, her reputation would be forever tarnished. Thirst began to torment her more intensely, her tongue feeling like sandpaper in her mouth. The laptop pressed against her ribs, its edges a constant reminder of James's sacrifice. She thought of Jennifer, working undercover, now having lost her father to the same corruption they were fighting. The weight of these revelations, combined with physical pain and dehydration, began to blur the lines between reality and hallucination. In this state of semi-delirium, Sarah became aware of something extraordinary. Her mother's ring, which had been a constant comfort, began to emit a faint, warm glow. At first she attributed it to her deteriorating mental state, but the light seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. A familiar scent filled the air, her mother's lavender perfume, impossible in this tomb of concrete and steel. Mum, Sarah whispered, her cracked lips barely able to form the word. The glow intensified slightly, casting a soft silver light that revealed the brutal reality of her prison. But instead of inspiring fear, the light brought an inexplicable sense of peace. In that moment, Sarah remembered her mother's words about faith being the bridge between despair and hope. The sound of shifting debris made her freeze. Through the same gap that had carried James's last words, she now heard whispers, countless whispers, like a congregation in prayer. Among them she could distinctly hear her mother's voice and James's, though their words were unclear. The rational part of her mind argued this was hypoxia, lack of water, or the onset of shock. Yet the warmth emanating from the ring felt undeniably real. As if responding to her thoughts, the whispers coalesced into a single message: truth cannot be buried. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling her tiny space with purpose. The light from the ring flickered like a heartbeat, each pulse bringing clarity to her confused mind. This wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about ensuring that James's death, her mother's secret fight, and the victims of Anderson's schemes wouldn't be in vain. Above her, she could hear the rescue workers making their final sweep of the area. Their voices were clinical, detached. Section B7 clear. Moving to C1, they were writing off this entire section of the building, sealing her fate without knowing she was there. The light from the ring dimmed slightly, but the warmth remained, as if acknowledging the gravity of her situation while promising she wasn't alone. Sarah touched the ring to her lips, tasting dust and blood but feeling a surge of determination. If these were to be her final hours, she would face them with the same courage her mother had shown fighting cancer, the same integrity James had maintained until his last breath. The laptop held truth that could save lives, expose corruption, and bring justice. Even if she didn't survive, somehow that truth had to reach the light. In the darkness of her concrete prison, Sarah Mitchell made a covenant with whatever divine presence was manifesting through her mother's ring. "I choose to believe," she whispered, "not just in rescue, but in justice. Use me as you will." The ring's glow steadied, becoming a small but unwavering beacon in the darkness, as if acknowledging her commitment. Time lost all meaning in Sarah's concrete prison. The only constants were darkness, pain, and the gentle glow of her mother's ring. Her medical training became both a blessing and a curse. She knew exactly how long a person could survive without water, how the body would gradually shut down, and what each new symptom signified. The pressure on her legs had become excruciating, and she could no longer feel her left foot. In the darkness, memories flooded her consciousness. She remembered her first day at St. Mary's Hospital, full of idealism and purpose. The faces of patients she'd helped, and those she couldn't save, paraded through her mind. Dr. Anderson's smiling mask as he announced budget cuts while wearing a new designer watch. Emily's betrayal, made worse by years of shared confidences and trust. Each memory carried new weight now, pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. The laptop had grown warm against her chest, its presence a constant reminder of the truth it contained. During more lucid moments, Sarah thought about James's revelations. Her mother hadn't just given her a ring, she'd passed on a legacy of fighting corruption. The thought that her mother had been investigating Anderson while battling cancer brought both pride and profound sadness. "You could have told me," she whispered into the darkness. "We could have fought together." As if in response to her words, the ring's glow intensified slightly, and that impossible scent of lavender returned. Sarah began talking to it, not sure if she was praying, hallucinating, or simply trying to stay sane. "I understand now, Mum, why you pushed me to take the job at St. Mary's, why you insisted I wear this ring. You knew someone had to continue your work." The pain in her legs reached new heights, and Sarah found herself reciting the Lord's Prayer, something she hadn't done since childhood. The words felt different now, each phrase carrying deeper meaning. "Thy will be done" took on new weight when faced with mortality. She thought of James's peaceful expression in his final moments, the way he spoke of seeing light. Was that what awaited her too? Through the gaps in the rubble, Sarah could still hear fragments of the world above. Rescue workers discussed diminishing hopes of finding survivors. News reports praised Dr. Anderson's leadership in the crisis, his voice smooth as oil as he spoke about doing everything possible. The irony made her laugh, though it came out as more of a sob. The man responsible for countless deaths was now being hailed as a hero. Dehydration began taking a severe toll. Sarah's thoughts became increasingly disjointed, reality blending with memory and dream. In these moments of delirium, she had conversations with her mother, with James, with patients long dead. They spoke of justice, of perseverance, of the light that truth brings to darkness. The ring's glow seemed to pulse with each exchange, as if confirming the reality of these impossible dialogues. During one particularly clear moment, Sarah realized she could hear water dripping somewhere nearby. The sound was maddening, so close yet inaccessible. She tried to focus on the ring's light instead, remembering her mother's words about faith being strongest in darkness. "Faith without evidence," she whispered, her voice rough from thirst. "Isn't that what they say, Mum? But you left me evidence, didn't you? You and James both." The laptop shifted slightly as another aftershock rumbled through the rubble. Sarah thought about all it contained: proof of Anderson's crimes, evidence of experiments on vulnerable patients, details of stolen funds and covered-up deaths. If she died here, would someone eventually find it? Would they understand its significance? Or would Anderson's influence ensure it was lost in the recovery effort? A new sound caught her attention, scrabbling noises in the darkness. Rats, she realized with horror. They were drawn to the scent of blood and death. The thought of them reaching James's body filled her with helpless anger. She began talking louder, hoping to scare them away, her voice growing stronger as she voiced her fears and hopes to the glowing ring. "I'm not afraid of dying," she told the darkness, surprised to find it was true. "But I'm terrified of the truth dying with me. All those patients, Mom. All those lives Anderson destroyed. James died trying to expose him. You died before you could finish what you started. It can't end here. Not like this." The ring's glow steadied, becoming more intense than before. Sarah felt that familiar warmth spread through her body, fighting against the cold that had been seeping into her bones. In that moment, she understood something profound about faith. It wasn't just about believing in rescue or survival, but about believing in purpose. Her mother and James had believed in her enough to entrust her with their work. Now, trapped in the dark, she finally understood why. "If this is my purpose," Sarah declared to the ring, her voice stronger despite her parched throat, "if this is why I'm here, then give me strength to see it through. Not my will, but yours be done." The words echoed in her small space, and for a moment the ring's light seemed to fill every crack and crevice, pushing back the darkness and the fear it contained. As the light subsided to its usual gentle glow, Sarah felt an inexplicable sense of peace settle over her. The pain was still there, the thirst still tormented her, but something had changed. She was no longer just a victim trapped in the rubble. She was a custodian of truth, a keeper of evidence that could save lives and bring justice. Whether she survived or not, she had a role to play in something larger than herself. Above the ruins of the Santiago building, a complex drama was unfolding under the harsh glare of emergency floodlights. Dr. Robert Anderson stood before a crowd of reporters, his usually immaculate appearance carefully disheveled to suggest hours of tireless work. "Our primary concern," he announced with practiced sincerity, "is locating all possible survivors. However, we must be realistic about which areas of the building warrant our limited resources." Behind the media circus, Emily Parker watched from the emergency medical station, guilt gnawing at her conscience. She had just treated her 10th patient from the building, each one reminding her of Sarah's dedication to patient care. The official story that Sarah had likely fled with stolen funds didn't align with the Sarah she had known for 15 years. The Sarah who had once stayed 3 days straight during a crisis, sleeping on a cot between shifts. Detective Mark Stevens observed the scene with growing suspicion. As head of the local police's corruption task force, he had been investigating Anderson for months, but could never gather enough evidence. Now, watching Anderson direct rescue efforts away from certain areas with suspicious specificity, his instinct screamed that something was wrong. His phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. Checked James Cooper's apartment. Time sensitive. In the command center, young rescue worker Michael Thompson argued with his supervisor, Carol Thompson, no relation. The thermal imaging showed potential heat signatures in the lower levels, he insisted, pointing to his tablet. "We can't just write off that entire section," Carol shook her head, showing him Anderson's report about structural instability. "It's too risky, Mike. We have confirmed survivors in other areas." Jennifer Cooper, maintaining her cover as Anderson's assistant, methodically documented every decision he made. Her grief for her father warred with her determination to complete their mission. She watched Anderson deliberately misdirect resources, noting how he seemed particularly concerned about the building's basement levels, the same levels where Sarah's apartment had been, where her father had insisted on staying despite Jennifer's pleas to move. The media had begun spinning narratives. Local news channels ran side-by-side images of Anderson coordinating rescue efforts and old footage of Sarah's disgrace. Sources suggest Mitchell may have embezzled up to $2 million from hospital charitable funds, one reporter announced. The timing of her disappearance, just hours before the earthquake, raises questions. Father David Wilson, watching the coverage from his church where he was coordinating relief efforts, felt his faith in human nature tested. He remembered Sarah's dedicated volunteer work at the church's free clinic, how she'd never turned away a patient regardless of their ability to pay. The accusations had never sat right with him, and now, watching Anderson's performance, he sensed a deeper darkness at work. As the sun rose on the second day, Detective Stevens made a breakthrough. In James Cooper's partially collapsed apartment, he found a sealed envelope addressed to him. Inside was a USB drive and a letter. "If you're reading this, something has happened. Everything on this drive is backed up on my laptop, which Sarah Mitchell has. Find her. She's the key." The detective's phone buzzed again, lower levels. "She never left." Emily, During a brief break, overheard Anderson speaking urgently on his phone, "I don't care what it takes. That section needs to be declared too unstable for rescue operations. No one goes in without my authorization." The tone sent chills down her spine, reminding her of similar conversations she'd overheard before Sarah's accusations. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that she might have chosen the wrong side. Michael Thompson, defying orders, conducted his own thermal scan of the basement area. The readings were weak but present signs of life among the ruins. When he tried to report his findings, he found himself reassigned to a distant sector of the rescue operation. But not before he managed to send his data to Detective Stevens, adding another piece to the growing puzzle. Jennifer, maintaining her calm facade, watched Anderson's increasing agitation with clinical detachment. Each time reports came in from the rescue teams, she noted how his eyes darted to the building's blueprints, specifically to the basement area. She had positioned herself as his indispensable assistant, documenting everything while feeding information to both Detective Stevens and Father Wilson. The church became an unexpected hub of resistance. Father Wilson, using his position in the community, began quietly gathering stories from hospital patients and families. A pattern emerged: missing records, unexplained deaths, disappeared complaints. He shared everything with Detective Stevens, while leading his congregation in prayers that felt more like battle cries for justice. As the second day wore on, the rescue operation began to split into two distinct efforts. The official operation, directed by Anderson, focused on the upper floors and media-friendly rescues. Meanwhile, a covert group led by Detective Stevens and supported by Michael's data, Jennifer's inside information, and Emily's growing cooperation began planning a separate search of the basement levels. Local news continued their coverage, but smaller outlets began asking questions. Why were certain areas being ignored? Why was the hospital administrator directing rescue operations? Photos surfaced of Sarah helping elderly residents evacuate during the initial quake, contradicting claims she had fled beforehand. The narrative was beginning to crack, just as the concrete tomb below held its secrets. In the pre-dawn hours of the third day, Michael Thompson crouched in the shadows of the disaster site, methodically reviewing his thermal imaging data. His years of rescue experience told him something wasn't right. The basement readings were weak but distinctive patterns that suggested not just residual heat, but the specific signature of human life. Every instinct he'd developed in a decade of search and rescue screamed that someone was down there, struggling to survive. A soft footstep behind him made him turn sharply. Detective Stevens emerged from the darkness, followed by Jennifer Cooper, her professional mask replaced by grim determination. "We have 90 minutes before the next shift change," Stevens said quietly. "Anderson's occupied with a press conference on the east side. Show me what you found." Michael spread out the thermal maps, explaining the anomalies that had caught his attention. "See these patterns? They're too regular for random heat signatures. And look here." He pointed to a particular area. "This matches the thermal footprint of someone in a confined space. They're alive, but running out of time." Jennifer produced a set of building plans marked with her father's meticulous notes. Dad suspected Anderson had modified the basement structure. These walls. She traced a section with her finger. They're newer than they should be. He thought Anderson was using the space to store sensitive documents. If Sarah's down there, she's probably trapped behind this section. The rescue equipment they'd assembled was minimal. They couldn't risk drawing attention. Michael had brought only essential tools and a small oxygen tank. Detective Stevens added medical supplies provided by Emily, who had finally chosen a side. Father Wilson had contributed something less tangible but equally vital. He'd organized a prayer vigil on the opposite side of the site, drawing Anderson's security team away from their target area. As they prepared to move, Jennifer handed Michael a small device. "It's a signal booster," she explained. "Dad designed it to penetrate concrete and steel. If Sarah has his laptop, this might help establish a connection." The unspoken implications hung in the air. If they could get the laptop online, everything would be exposed. Their descent into the building's ruins was painstakingly slow. Michael led the way, testing each step, hyper-aware that one wrong move could trigger a secondary collapse. The darkness was absolute, broken only by their carefully shielded lights. The air grew thicker with dust and the peculiar stillness of buried spaces. Through his headset, Michael heard Emily's warning Anderson's wrapping up early. "You have maybe 30 minutes." Jennifer's hand gripped his shoulder, urging him forward. They were committed now. Turning back would mean abandoning any hope of reaching Sarah in time. The thermal scanner led them through a maze of twisted metal and shattered concrete. Michael noted how the debris patterns seemed wrong. Some areas had been cleared recently, others deliberately blocked. "Someone's been down here," he whispered. Stevens nodded grimly, documenting everything with a small camera. They reached a partially cleared passage that matched Jennifer's modified blueprints. Michael's equipment registered a stronger heat signature, accompanied by something else, a faint, silvery light seeping through the cracks in the rubble. The light seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, defying scientific explanation. As they began carefully removing debris, Jennifer's signal booster suddenly activated. A weak electronic signal penetrated the ruins. The laptop was there, and somehow still functioning. Detective Stevens immediately began transmitting the coordinates to his backup team. If anything happened to them, others would know where to dig. The silvery light grew stronger as they worked, illuminating their efforts with an otherworldly glow. Michael, a man of science and concrete facts, found himself working in concert with something he couldn't explain. Each piece of debris they moved seemed to shift more easily than it should, guided by the pulsing light. Their timeline had nearly expired when Michael's tools finally broke through. The opening was small, but in the convergence of his light and the silver glow, he could see a hand wearing a silver ring. The fingers moved weakly, acknowledging their presence. "Sarah," he called softly. "We're here to help. Just hold on." The response was barely audible but clear. The laptop. Get the laptop first. Even in her dire condition, Sarah understood priorities. Michael admired her strength, even as his medical training assessed her critical condition. They needed to move fast, but they also needed to preserve the evidence that had cost James Cooper his life. Just then, Emily's voice crackled through their headsets with renewed urgency. "Anderson knows. He's heading your way with security. Get her out now." The silvery light flared brightly, as if responding to the danger. In that crucial moment, Michael Thompson made a decision that would change everything. They would save both Sarah and the truth, or die trying. The silvery light from Sarah's ring illuminated the rescue scene with increasing intensity, creating an otherworldly atmosphere in the buried chamber. As Michael and his team worked frantically to widen the opening, Sarah faced her greatest test of faith. Above them, they could hear Anderson and his security team approaching, their footsteps sending threatening vibrations through the unstable structure. The moment they pulled the laptop free, Sarah felt a searing pain through her body. The device that had been pressed against her for days had become a part of her, and its removal felt like losing a piece of herself. But it was the choice she now faced that truly tested her soul. The rescue opening was small. They could save either her or the laptop immediately, but not both. With Anderson moments away, there was no time for second attempts. "Take it," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse but firm. "The evidence. It has to survive." Even as she spoke, her mother's ring pulsed with an almost blinding intensity. The light seemed to reach into every corner of the space, revealing paths through the rubble that hadn't been visible before. Jennifer grabbed her father's laptop, tears streaming down her face as she realized the depth of Sarah's sacrifice. Detective Stevens' voice cut through the tension. "We saved both." The ring's light coalesced around them, and suddenly the debris began shifting on its own, as if guided by an unseen force. Pieces of concrete that should have been immovable lifted away with surprising ease. The silver glow formed what appeared to be a protective dome around them, holding back the threatening collapse above. Sarah felt her mother's presence more strongly than ever before. The scent of lavender filled the chamber, and in the extraordinary light she could almost see familiar figures moving among the rescue team, her mother, James, and others who had fought this battle before them. They weren't just memories or hallucinations, they were witnesses to this moment of truth. Anderson's voice echoed from above, ordering his men to seal the entrance. But the light from Sarah's ring had grown so bright that it was visible through the cracks in the rubble, creating a beacon that drew others to their location. Father Wilson arrived with a group of parishioners, forming a human chain to prevent Anderson's interference. Emily appeared with medical supplies, publicly choosing her side at last. As Michael finally managed to free Sarah's legs, she experienced something extraordinary. The pain that had been her constant companion transformed into a warm current of energy flowing from the ring. In that moment, she understood that her mother's gift had been more than just jewelry. It was a testament to the enduring power of truth and faith. The rescue passage was still treacherously small, and Sarah's weakened condition made movement almost impossible. Yet as they began their careful extraction, the silver light seemed to strengthen her, each pulse matching her heartbeat, each wave of warmth giving her the energy to continue. The divine presence was palpable, not just protecting them but actively guiding their escape. Anderson, realizing he was losing control of the situation, made his final desperate move. "That woman is delirious," he shouted to the gathering crowd. "She's been trapped for days without water. Anything she says or any documents she claims to have are the products of a disturbed mind." But even as he spoke, Jennifer had connected her father's signal booster to the laptop. The truth was already uploading, spreading across networks faster than Anderson could contain it. The moment Sarah emerged from the rubble, supported by Michael and surrounded by the silver light that had become her guardian, a profound silence fell over the crowd. She was covered in dust, dehydrated, and barely able to stand, but her eyes burned with an intensity that matched the glow of her mother's ring. The laptop in Jennifer's hands beeped, confirming the complete transmission of its contents. Anderson's face contorted with rage and fear as he watched his carefully constructed world crumble. He made one last attempt to rush forward, but the light from Sarah's ring flared between them like a shield. In that brilliant illumination, everyone present could see the truth written on his face, the corruption, the murders, the years of deception, all exposed in a single divine moment. Sarah, standing with the support of those who had risked everything to rescue her, looked at her former tormentor with a mixture of pity and triumph. "The truth," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its weakness, "always finds the light." The ring's glow softened to a gentle radiance, its purpose fulfilled but its presence remaining as a testament to the power of faith and justice. The triumph of Sarah's rescue was quickly overshadowed by the devastating toll on her body. As the adrenaline faded, she collapsed in the ambulance, her vital signs plummeting. The paramedics worked frantically, their faces grim as they assessed her injuries: severe dehydration, crushing injuries to both legs, internal bleeding, and the early stages of kidney failure from days without water. "We're losing her," the words echoed through the ambulance as Sarah's consciousness began to fade. The world around her grew distant, the siren's wail becoming a muffled hum. The silver ring on her finger grew warm again, but differently, this time not the protective warmth of before, but a gentle beckoning. As her heart rate faltered on the monitor, Sarah found herself drifting into a space between worlds. In this ethereal state, she saw her mother waiting in a garden filled with impossible light. Lisa Mitchell looked exactly as she had before the cancer, her face radiant with health and joy. Behind her stood James Cooper, whole and unbowed by age. They were joined by others, patients who had died under Anderson's care, their faces peaceful now, free from pain and fear. "Not yet, sweetheart," her mother said softly, reaching out but not quite touching her. "Your work isn't finished." James nodded in agreement, his eyes twinkling with familiar wisdom. "The truth is free," he added, "but justice needs a witness." The other figures murmured in agreement, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the deepening light around them. Sarah felt the pull of both worlds, the peace and completeness of this realm versus the pain and struggle that awaited her return. Her mother's ring pulsed steadily, its rhythm matching the distant beeping of hospital machines fighting to keep her alive. Through this connection, she could feel the prayers and hopes of those gathered around her physical form. The scene shifted, and Sarah witnessed the impact of Anderson's crimes from a perspective that transcended earthly limitations. She saw the full scope of his corruption, the lives destroyed, the families shattered. But she also saw the ripples of change already spreading from the exposed truth investigations beginning, victims finding their voices, a system of corruption starting to crumble. "It hurts so much," Sarah whispered, feeling the weight of her broken body even in this spiritual space. Her mother's expression filled with infinite compassion. "Pain reminds us we're alive," she repeated her old wisdom. "And being alive means we can make a difference." The ring grew warmer, channeling strength from this realm of light back into Sarah's failing body. The medical team's voices broke through. She's stabilizing the boundary between worlds began to blur as Sarah felt herself being pulled back. Before the garden of light faded, her mother pressed something into her hand, not physical, but a warmth that spread through her entire being. "Your ring will always connect us," Lisa promised, "but your place is still there, fighting the good fight." James stepped forward one last time. "Tell Jennifer I'm proud." The Cooper legacy of seeking truth continues through her. The other figures raised their hands in blessing as the scene began to dissolve. Their collective message was clear: Sarah's survival had purpose beyond mere living. She was meant to be a bridge between truth and justice, between faith and action. Reality crashed back with brutal force. Every nerve ending screamed as Sarah's consciousness returned to her broken body. The hospital room came into focus, machines beeping, medical staff moving urgently, familiar faces watching anxiously through the window. The pain was overwhelming, but it carried her mother's message: she was alive, and that meant hope remained. Through cracked lips, Sarah managed to whisper words that the attending nurse had to lean close to hear. "Light always finds a way." The silver ring glinted under the harsh hospital lights, its ordinary appearance masking the extraordinary connection it represented. Sarah Mitchell had walked through the valley of death and returned, not just with her life, but with an unshakable certainty about her purpose in the ongoing battle for truth and justice. The hospital waiting room became an unlikely courtroom of conscience as the community grappled with the emerging truth. Local news channels ran continuous coverage of Anderson's exposed crimes, interspersed with footage of Sarah's rescue and the mysterious light that witnesses couldn't explain. Each revelation hit the town like a physical blow, forcing people to confront their role in enabling years of corruption through their silence and quick judgments. Emily Parker sat alone in the hospital chapel, her nurse's uniform feeling like a costume she no longer deserved to wear. She watched through tears as her phone filled with messages from colleagues sharing their own stories of suspicions ignored and concerns dismissed. The evidence from James's laptop revealed that she hadn't just betrayed her best friend, she had helped cover up crimes that led to patient deaths. Former patients and their families began gathering outside the hospital, their numbers growing as more stories emerged. Mrs. Henderson, who had escaped the earthquake thanks to Sarah's help, now stood with a sign listing the names of those who had died under Anderson's care. Among them was her own husband, whose routine surgery had somehow led to unexplained complications and missing records. The local newspaper, which had once gleefully reported Sarah's disgrace, now published a scathing self-examination of their role in Anderson's scheme. The editor's front page apology detailed how they had accepted Anderson's narratives without investigation, prioritizing sensationalism over truth. Their archive photos took on new meaning. Sarah's expression, as she left her disciplinary hearing, now read as determination rather than guilt. Father Wilson opened the church for a community vigil, but it became something closer to a public confession. One by one, people stood to acknowledge their rush to judgment, their willing blindness, their failure to stand by someone who had always stood by them. The pews filled with those seeking not just divine forgiveness, but Sarah as though she lay unconscious, fighting for her life in intensive care. Jennifer Cooper released her father's complete investigation to the authorities, revealing the systematic way Anderson had isolated and discredited anyone who questioned his authority. The community was forced to confront how easily they had accepted the persecution of a woman whose only crime was caring too much. The question, why didn't we see it echoed through conversations across town? Detective Stevens, in press conferences that drew national attention, detailed how Anderson had manipulated not just hospital records but community sentiment. He described a sophisticated operation that relied as much on public shame and isolation as it did on financial fraud. The detective's voice cracked as he admitted that law enforcement had been slow to investigate earlier complaints, deferring to Anderson's reputation rather than examining evidence. The hospital board members, facing their own complicity, resigned en masse. Interim leadership discovered that Anderson's corruption went beyond financial fraud. He had been using the hospital's charitable foundation to fund unauthorized experimental treatments, treating vulnerable patients as unwitting test subjects. Each revelation brought new waves of shame and horror to those who had enabled his reign. Social media exploded with old photos and memories of Sarah's kindness, the extra hours she spent with dying patients, the home visits to those who couldn't afford transport, the gentle way she explained complicated medical procedures to frightened children. These posts often ended with variations of "I'm sorry I didn't speak up" or "I should have known better." Outside Sarah's ICU room, a wall of apology notes grew like a paper garden of remorse. Among them was a tear-stained letter from Emily, detailing her journey from doubt to betrayal to devastating regret. Next to it hung a photo of Sarah and Emily in nursing school, their young faces full of idealism about changing the world through caring for others. The silver ring on Sarah's finger caught the light as she lay healing, seeming to glow faintly whenever someone new came to make peace with their conscience. The medical staff caring for her whispered about its strange warmth, some claiming it provided comfort to those who touched it, while offering their apologies to its unconscious owner. The contents of James Cooper's laptop sent shockwaves through the medical community far beyond Abruzzo. Detective Stevens and his cybercrime team worked around the clock, uncovering layers of corruption that stretched back nearly 2 decades. The files weren't just spreadsheets and documents. They told a story of systematic abuse of power that had claimed countless lives. James had built his case like a master journalist, creating an intricate web of evidence that connected every death, every missing dollar, every covered-up experiment. The laptop contained thousands of photographs, many taken through the hospital windows from his apartment, showing suspicious late-night deliveries and unauthorized patient transfers. Each image was meticulously dated and cross-referenced with hospital records that Sarah had helped him obtain. Most damning were the video recordings. Anderson had been careless in his arrogance, holding meetings in his office without checking for surveillance. James had managed to capture countless conversations through high-powered microphones, including one particularly chilling discussion about using terminal patients for unauthorized drug trials. "They're dying anyway," Anderson had said, laughing as he counted his kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies. The financial evidence was equally devastating. Sarah's initial suspicions about missing charitable funds had barely scratched the surface. Anderson had created a complex network of shell companies, each one siphoning money from different hospital departments. Funds meant for children's cancer treatment had paid for his vacation homes. Donations for new medical equipment had financed his luxury cars. Every dollar was traced, every transaction documented. Jennifer Cooper's undercover work provided the final pieces. Her position as Anderson's assistant had given her access to his private files, including a list of potential whistleblowers he had systematically destroyed. Sarah's name wasn't the first on that list. There had been others who had tried to expose him, each one carefully discredited and driven away. Some had died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths logged as unfortunate accidents or stress-related health issues. The laptop also contained encrypted files about experimental treatments that Anderson had authorized without oversight or patient consent. These weren't just trials for new medications, they were radical procedures performed on patients who had been deliberately misdiagnosed as terminal. The success rates were abysmal, but the pharmaceutical companies paid well for the data, no questions asked. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the personal stories James had collected. Interviews with family members who had lost loved ones, testimonies from nurses who had been forced to falsify records, letters from patients who had survived Anderson's experiments but lived in fear of speaking out. Each story had been carefully preserved, waiting for the moment when justice would finally be possible. Lisa Mitchell's involvement added another layer to the investigation. Sarah's mother had been gathering evidence even as she fought cancer, using her regular hospital visits to document suspicious patterns. Her final gift to Sarah, the silver ring, hadn't just been a piece of jewelry. Hidden in its cross design was a micro SD card containing vital information that James had later incorporated into his investigation. The technical analysis of the laptop revealed sophisticated security measures. James had created an automated system that would activate if the device connected to the internet after a certain period of inactivity. This failsafe had triggered during Sarah's rescue, sending copies of all files to multiple law enforcement agencies and news organizations simultaneously. Anderson's attempts to contain the information had been futile. The truth had spread too far, too fast. Detective Stevens brought in financial crimes experts from the FBI to unravel the complex money trails. They discovered that Anderson's corruption extended into local government, with kickbacks paid to officials who had helped suppress previous investigations. The earthquake, tragic as it was, had provided the perfect opportunity to expose everything nature's intervention where human justice had failed. Sarah's original allegations about the charitable funds now seemed almost quaint compared to the full scope of Anderson's crimes. The investigation revealed that he had been using the hospital as a front for what amounted to unauthorized human experimentation, all while maintaining the facade of a respected healthcare administrator. His carefully cultivated image as a philanthropist had allowed him to operate in plain sight, using public trust as a shield for his activities. As the evidence mounted, international medical journals began retracting papers Anderson had published based on his illegal trials. His academic reputation, built on stolen lives and falsified data, crumbled. Pharmaceutical companies that had partnered with him scrambled to distance themselves, though their own complicity was well documented in James's files. The ripples of the investigation threatened to reshape medical research oversight across the country. The Abruzzo courthouse had never seen such a crowd. People began gathering before dawn on the day of Anderson's arraignment, their numbers swelling until they filled the square. Among them were families of his victims, former patients, hospital staff, and community members who had once shunned Sarah. They stood together in silent witness as police led Anderson through the gauntlet of faces he had betrayed. Inside the courtroom, Sarah sat with Jennifer Cooper, both women drawing strength from each other's presence. The silver ring on Sarah's finger caught the morning light, seeming to pulse with quiet certainty. Anderson, stripped of his designer suits and authority, barely glanced their way as he shuffled in wearing prison orange, his handcuffs a stark contrast to the Rolex watches he once flaunted. The charges took nearly an hour to read: multiple counts of murder, fraud, criminal negligence, unauthorized human experimentation, and corruption. Each charge echoed through the hushed courtroom, painting a picture of systematic evil that had festered beneath a veneer of respectability. When the judge denied bail, citing the overwhelming evidence from James's laptop, a collective exhale of relief rippled through the spectators. Emily Parker testified first, her voice shaking as she detailed her role in Anderson's schemes. Her testimony revealed how he had manipulated staff through a combination of threats, bribes, and psychological warfare. He made us believe Sarah was the enemy, she explained, tears streaming down her face. But we were helping him destroy everything we'd sworn to protect as medical professionals. The hospital board members faced their own day of reckoning. One by one, they were called to account for their willful blindness. The evidence showed they had ignored repeated warnings, choosing institutional reputation over patient safety. Their resignations were just the beginning. Many faced criminal charges for their complicity in Anderson's crimes. But local officials who had helped suppress previous investigations found themselves under federal scrutiny. The mayor, who had once led the public criticism of Sarah, was indicted for accepting bribes. The earthquake had not only shaken the ground, it had cracked the foundations of corruption that had supported Anderson's empire. The pharmaceutical companies implicated in the unauthorized trials faced massive federal investigations and civil lawsuits. Their stock prices plummeted as James's evidence revealed the extent of their knowledge and participation in Anderson's experiments. The industry-wide scandal prompted calls for stricter oversight and accountability in medical research. In a particularly poignant moment, Jennifer presented her father's final research to the court. The meticulous documentation, preserved through Sarah's ordeal in the rubble, provided an unassailable record of Anderson's crimes. James Cooper received posthumous recognition from the National Journalists Association for his investigation, his legacy secured in the pursuit of truth he dedicated his final years to exposing. The community's transformation was profound and lasting. Local businesses that had once shunned Sarah now displayed her photo prominently, though she found the attention uncomfortable. The hospital was renamed the Cooper Mitchell Medical Center, dedicated to ethical patient care and transparency. A new whistleblower protection program was established, ensuring that future Sarah Mitchells would never face persecution for speaking truth to power. Father Wilson led the spiritual healing of the community, his sermons focusing on redemption and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. The church established a foundation in Lisa Mitchell's name, providing support for healthcare whistleblowers and their families. The Silver Cross ring became a symbol of this mission, replicated in the foundation's logo as a reminder that faith and integrity are inseparable. Detective Stevens used the case to reform police procedures for investigating medical corruption. The lessons learned from Anderson's long reign of terror led to new protocols and training programs. Sarah was invited to speak at police academies, teaching future detectives the subtle signs of institutional corruption she had first noticed. As Anderson and his conspirators were led away to begin their sentences, Sarah stood outside the courthouse with Jennifer. The morning sun caught her mother's ring, creating a brief flash of silver light that reminded everyone present of the miraculous glow that had guided her rescuers. Justice isn't just about punishment, she told the gathered reporters. It's about healing and change. The story of Abruzzo's transformation became a case study in medical ethics programs across the country. Students learned not just about Anderson's crimes, but about the collective responsibility to question authority and protect the vulnerable. Sarah's experience proved that one person's courage, supported by faith and determination, could crack even the strongest facades of corruption. Sarah's recovery challenged both medical science and faith. The damage from her days trapped in the rubble went beyond physical trauma. Her body and soul had been transformed by an experience that defied ordinary explanation. The hospital room where she recovered became a sacred space of sorts, where the boundaries between physical healing and spiritual awakening seemed to blur. The injuries were severe: multiple fractures in both legs, severe dehydration that had damaged her kidneys, and complications from being trapped in a confined space for days. The medical team was amazed she had survived at all. Yet something extraordinary was happening alongside the standard medical care. Nurses reported that patients in nearby rooms experienced unexplained peace, their own recovery rates improving after brief encounters with Sarah. Her mother's ring remained a source of wonder. Though its miraculous glow had dimmed after the rescue, it retained a subtle warmth that doctors couldn't explain. Those who touched it while caring for Sarah often spoke of feeling a profound sense of purpose afterward. The ring seemed to serve as a bridge between the visible world of medical science and something deeper, more mysterious. Emily became Sarah's primary nurse, their shared history adding layers of healing to every interaction. As she helped Sarah through the grueling physical therapy sessions, their conversations evolved from tentative apologies to deep discussions about faith, forgiveness, and redemption. "You never lost your light," Emily observed one difficult afternoon, "even when we tried to extinguish it." Father Wilson visited daily, but instead of offering spiritual guidance, he found himself receiving it. Sarah's insights about faith, forged in darkness and vindicated in light, transformed his understanding of ministry. The prayers they shared were less about asking for divine intervention and more about acknowledging the sacred in every moment of healing, every small victory over pain. Jennifer Cooper became a constant presence, working through her own grief by supporting Sarah's recovery. They formed a bond that transcended their shared trauma, united by the legacy of those who had sacrificed everything for truth. Together, they established a support group for others affected by medical corruption, creating a space where healing could happen through shared experience and understanding. The physical therapy sessions became metaphors for larger truths. Each painful step represented not just Sarah's personal recovery, but the community's journey toward healing. Her determination to walk again inspired others facing their own battles. Pain with purpose, she would say during particularly challenging moments, is a path to something greater. Sarah's medical knowledge gave her a unique perspective on her own recovery. She understood every setback and breakthrough in clinical terms, yet she also recognized something beyond scientific explanation at work. The way her body healed seemed to follow not just medical protocols but a deeper rhythm, as if her mother's ring was conducting an orchestra of restoration that played both physical and spiritual notes. Dreams and visions continued to be part of her healing journey. In quiet moments, particularly when the ring felt warmest, Sarah experienced vivid conversations with her mother and James. These weren't the desperate hallucinations of her time in the rubble, but gentle encounters that left her with renewed strength and clarity. The medical staff learned to recognize when she'd had these experiences her vital signs would show marked improvement, and her pain levels would temporarily decrease. Most remarkably, Sarah's presence began affecting systemic change within the hospital itself. Her room became a kind of informal consulting space where healthcare workers would gather to discuss ethical challenges and seek guidance. Her experience had given her a unique authority to speak about the intersection of medical care and moral courage. The healing taking place wasn't just personal, it was institutional and communal. 1 year after the earthquake, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium of the newly renamed Cooper Mitchell Medical Center, her mother's ring catching the sunlight as she addressed the graduating class of nurses. The story of her ordeal had become more than a local legend. It had sparked a national movement for medical ethics reform and whistleblower protection that was transforming healthcare across the country. The Cooper Mitchell Foundation, established with funds recovered from Anderson's criminal enterprise, had grown into a powerful force for change. Under the joint leadership of Sarah and Jennifer, it provided legal support for healthcare whistleblowers, funded independent oversight of medical research, and offered scholarships to nursing students committed to ethical practice. The silver cross that had once glowed in darkness now served as the foundation's symbol, a reminder that faith and integrity could illuminate the darkest corners of corruption. Sarah's weekly ethics rounds became mandatory training for all hospital staff. Medical students and seasoned professionals alike sat in rapt attention as she shared not just her story, but the practical wisdom gained from her experience. Ethics isn't abstract, she would tell them. It's about choices we make every day, small decisions that ripple out to affect countless lives. Her approach to medical ethics, grounded in both professional expertise and personal experience, was being adopted by teaching hospitals nationwide. The support group she and Jennifer had started evolved into a national network connecting survivors of medical abuse with advocates and resources. Monthly meetings still took place in Father Wilson's church, but they were now live-streamed to similar groups across the country. The healing that had begun in one small community was spreading, touching lives far beyond Abruzzo's borders. Emily Parker, fully rehabilitated in her role as head nurse, implemented new protocols for reporting concerns that became known as the Mitchell Standards. These guidelines ensured that no healthcare worker would ever have to choose between conscience and career. The system emphasized collective responsibility and provided multiple channels for raising ethical concerns without fear of retaliation. The physical scars from Sarah's ordeal remained, but they had become powerful teaching tools. During particularly challenging cases, she would sometimes roll up her sleeve to show the marks left by her time in the rubble. These scars, she would say, remind us that healing isn't just about treating symptoms, it's about addressing the deeper wounds in our healthcare system. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Sarah's legacy was the way it changed how people viewed the relationship between faith and medical practice. The unexplained phenomena surrounding her rescue, the glowing ring, the mysterious light that had guided her rescuers, became part of medical school discussions about the limits of scientific understanding and the role of spiritual belief in healing. Detective Stevens regularly invited Sarah to speak at law enforcement conferences, where her story helped bridge the gap between medical oversight and criminal justice. The protocols developed during Anderson's investigation became the foundation for a new approach to investigating healthcare fraud, one that recognized the complex interplay between institutional power and individual courage. Lisa Mitchell's ring, now as much a symbol as a piece of jewelry, continued its subtle influence. Though it never again displayed the dramatic luminescence of the rescue, those who knew Sarah best swore it still glowed faintly during moments of particular significance. The ring became a reminder that some truths transcend scientific explanation, and that faith could be as tangible as any medical instrument. On the anniversary of James Cooper's death, Sarah and Jennifer established a journalism scholarship in his name, ensuring that future generations would have the tools and support to investigate corruption wherever it appeared. James's meticulous approach to gathering evidence became part of the curriculum at journalism schools, teaching students that patience and precision were as important as courage in exposing wrongdoing. In the depths of darkness, faith becomes more than just belief. It transforms into a tangible force that guides us through seemingly impossible trials. Sarah Mitchell's journey reveals that truth, like light, cannot be buried forever. Her mother's ring wasn't just a symbol of faith, it was a beacon that illuminated the path when all other lights had failed. The story reminds us that sometimes our greatest trials become our most powerful testimonies, and that justice, though delayed, finds its way through even the smallest cracks in the walls of corruption. Through Sarah's ordeal, we learn that true healing extends beyond the physical. It touches souls, transforms communities, and bridges the gap between science and faith. Her legacy teaches us that one person's unwavering integrity, supported by faith and determination, can spark a revolution of conscience that ripples through generations to come. Dear valued viewers, if this story has touched your heart and resonated with your soul, please consider supporting our team by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue creating meaningful content that inspires and moves people. Share this video with your friends and family who might find comfort and strength in Sarah's extraordinary journey. Don't forget to like this video and leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story affected you. Would you like to hear part 2 of this remarkable tale? Let us know in the comments, and your feedback will help guide our next storytelling adventure.